One of my favorite movie quotes of all time is from Gone with the Wind. Now, Gone with the Wind is a horribly racist movie, but I'd argue that if there's one artifact that can be salvaged from the film, despite one of the most stellar-leading performances by a woman in film history, it's this quote. So let's set the scene. We've been following Scarlett O'Hara's theatrics for a staggering 3.5 hours, and all this time, we've been rooting for her to stay with her husband, Rhett Butler. And the second she decides she wants to, albeit for his money, he leaves her. We're just about to feel bad for Scarlett when Rhett Butler ends it all with a concise, fiery bang. It's just so good, and I know I'm not the only one who thinks so, because this quote is everywhere. On t-shirts, on stickers, on article headlines, and I'd be willing to bet that those of you who haven't even seen the movie have heard some variation of this line. See, these quotes are everywhere. They're recycled in newer media, stuck on merch, and used in our daily lives. But these sound bites really do permeate our daily lives, so much so that the American Film Institute created a list of the top 100 greatest American movie quotes, with Frankly, My Dear, I Don't Give a Damn clocking in at number 1. And I thought this was interesting, considering that taste in movies, let alone ways of speaking, vary so much from person to person. So how could there ever be some objective consensus over which quote is the best? So then I began thinking, if we can use films to assess both personal and collective values, what do the quotes with which we connect say about us? And to understand that, we first need to understand why certain movie quotes stick out more than others. So you have movies like Mean Girls or Casablanca, which I know are really weird movies to group together, but just go with me on this one, where almost every line is either hilarious or emotionally impactful. So which lines could ever be universally remembered? Researchers at Cornell University determined that the conversational information that achieves widespread public awareness have two things in common: lexical distinctiveness and potential for widespread application. So, for example, some Mean Girls' most famous lines rhythmically stand out because they're repeated or seem incongruous with the surrounding dialogue. So we know that on Wednesdays we wear pink because Karen so randomly punctuated her movie introduction with it. We know that fetch is never going to happen because fetch just never seems to fit properly within a sentence. And You Go Glen Coco has inherent rhyme, rhythm, and randomness. Now, Casablanca doesn't have the same links between humor and memory working in its favor. However, it does invoke the same principle of lexical distinctiveness. So, Casablanca is just chock full of transatlantic dialogue and complex speaking patterns. So the lines that we remember from that movie are the lines of the most direct today. And more interestingly, they're the most applicable. So we can use, I think this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship, anytime we're trying to get to know a new person. We can change the noun "and will always have Paris" to invoke a sense of personalized nostalgia. And while I could easily congratulate someone with the "You Go Glen Coco," saying, "Well, here's looking at you, kid," invokes a sense of nostalgia, maybe even grief, in that same congratulatory message. Now, sometimes we remember dialogue not because we want to, but because we are seeing our experiences and emotions being validated on the screen. And I call this involuntary connection. Films have the capacity to broaden our ideological horizons, putting our emotions into words and sequences of which we could never have dreamed. And when we see our emotions in those sequences, we are affected personally. These are things that have happened to us. So when we see that in these movies, that affects what we remember from the film. So for example, Gone Girl came out in 2013. However, if you type Gone Girl monologue into TikTok, video upon video of girls reciting that monologue, word for word, will come up. Heck, if you meet up with me after the show, I can probably do it too. But the fact remains that 10 years after this movie's release, a new generation of young girls has found this monologue, one about how we're conditioned to change ourselves for male approval, and either realize this phenomenon for the first time or connected with the deeply biting way in which this argument is delivered, and, whether consciously or subconsciously, decided to commit that monologue to memory. Involuntary connection also occurs when we connect with a quote as a piece of advice. For example, if you logged on to Tumblr in the 2010s, we accept the love we think we deserve from perks of being a wallflower was everywhere. Because that's the thing. Co-opting dialogue allows us to use the work's contexts as shortcuts to explain our emotions and construct our own images. And I call this voluntary connection. Now here's an example. When I was about 8 or so, I was cast in a production of Seussical, in which a lot of the ensemble members were given sunglasses as part of their costumes. And we all thought that these sunglasses were just the coolest things ever. So of course, we all took turns trying them on, suavely spinning them around, and saying, "I'm Bond, James Bond." We were tiny. I was 8. I'd probably never even seen a James Bond film, but we all knew that Bond equaled cool, so saying the line made us see cool. But let's use a more dependable example. Quite often, drag performers will co-opt movie quotes into their acts to portray certain characters or personas. For example, the American drag artist John Epperson, also known as Lip Synca, became very famous and very known for using the personas of old Hollywood starlets in his acts, such as Joan Crawford, about whom the movie Mommy Dearest was created. In Epperson's show entitled The Passion of the Crawford, he would dress in full Crawford drag and would latch onto lines like "Barbara, please" in his act to comment on the Crawford persona. Not just the real one, but the one that he was constructing for himself. Even when we don't intentionally try to craft an image via a quote, we can't separate the dialogue from these highly recognizable characters and contexts. I mean, you can't separate the menacing, strategic feeling of "I'm going to make him an offer he can't refuse" from the calculated Godfather himself. And we can use standalone quotes too. Instead of saying "I'm stoked," I could say "I'm king of the world." And I don't have to say I'm feeling uncomfortable and afraid, when I could just as easily say "I have a feeling we're not in Kansas anymore." Because that's the thing. We cannot separate what we say from these movies from these characters. And for example, have you ever actually referenced a work that no one else in the room has seen? None of you? Raise your hands, I want to see them. There we go. All right, I thought so. It's not just me. And for those of you who have, I know how that feels. And for those of you who haven't, I'm deeply envious because it really does sting. Because A, not only would my joke have been so funny if someone had just recognized my quote from The Princess Bride, but second of all, I effectively failed in trying to establish an interpersonal bond with another person because I was leaning on a work that I really loved. However, it wasn't effective because that other person didn't have the same love for my reference. What we've got here is failure to communicate. I had to. I love Cool Hand Luke. But anyway, on the other hand, when both parties do recognize a reference, there's this initial moment of celebration and unity that opens the doors for a bond to form. And I call this operational connection. If another person expresses interest in the quotes and the movies that we hold dear, a commonality is formed. And commonality builds connection. And when that commonality is love for a piece of media transmitted by a movie quote, a short soundbite of dialogue with the power to signal beliefs, project multidimensional personas, and translate complex emotions, that tiny soundbite becomes a tool for fostering meaningful relationships. So you may be thinking, why is she only focusing on movies? Movies have traditionally been low-commitment, digestible, accessible forms of entertainment that more effectively reach larger audiences than other mediums. Movies are widespread human connection made easy. Films don't just have the capacity to reflect and change culture, but they reflect and change who we are as people. When we connect with a work or a line of dialogue, we absorb that philosophy whether or not we realize it. And when we listen between the lines of the content we most absorb, we hear ourselves. So assess the films that you connect with. Really think about the dialogue that you repeat, because it says a lot about who you are, what you love, and who you want to be. And frankly, my dears, you should give a damn about that.